Finally, Raspberry Pi users can get rid of flaky microSD cards and boot off of NVMe SSDs using a hat like this. This is the HatDrive Top Edition from Pineberry Pi, and I'd like to thank them for sending this, as well as the HatDrive BM1, or the HatDrive Bottom, that goes underneath the Raspberry Pi. These two boards allow you to put an NVMe SSD, which can be much more reliable and much faster, on a Raspberry Pi 5 using its PCI Express connection. That's this little connector on the Raspberry Pi 5. Now, a lot of people are asking me, does this fit in a Raspberry Pi 5 case? And the answer to that is yes, it will. Now, this is not the actual final production hardware. This is a prototype that they sent me to test. And if I pop that on there, it fits just inside of this little case if you remove the fan from this case. There's normally a fan there. The problem is that when you put all this together, there's not much ventilation, so I don't really recommend that. It will fit and it will run, but it will probably throttle somewhat. So instead, I have over here my other Raspberry Pi 5, and it has an active cooler on top. And this is not the actual hardware that will be shipping. This is just my little janky setup. But if you put this on top, it will hold it off of the Pi enough so that there's airflow into the active cooler. So the way that this works is you put an NVMe SSD on top. This is a maker disk from Cytron. They sent me this like a year or two ago. I've never actually tested it, but I did format it, so it's empty right now. You put this in, and then you put this on top of the Pi, and then you connect one of these little cables. Now this is called an FPC or FFC, flat flexible circuit board cable. It's literally a circuit board, but it's very flat and it's flexible. That's why they call it that. This is an impedance controlled one. You can see that there's different trace widths, and it has some shielding. The one that I was using in my early testing of the Raspberry Pi is not impedance controlled, so I had some issues with signaling, and so this cable is very handy. They also make a 100mm version of this cable. But one thing to keep in mind if you're buying any of these kind of things is orientation matters very much here. So there's a little arrow on the cable, and I don't believe there's an arrow on the Raspberry Pi 5, but there is an arrow on this board. So when you're installing the cable, you want to line up those little itty-bitty triangles. But the first thing I want to do is put Raspberry Pi OS on here so I can boot from it. Raspberry Pis don't come with bootable NVMe by default. You have to kind of enable that, so I'll show you how to do that. So this Raspberry Pi 5 already has a microSD card with Raspberry Pi OS on it, so I'm going to boot that up too. But first, let's flash this in Raspberry Pi Imager. On my computer, I have this little USB, I call it the puck. It's like a little puck that I can put this NVMe drive in, and it's nice to have, but you can pop this in, and I'm going to plug it into my Mac using, whoa, this is the kind of thing that I edit out if I'm scripting a video, but I'll leave it in for your enjoyment. When you're trying to work one-handed, it's not always that fun. Okay, there we go. It's plugged in, and up here, if I open up Imager, I should be able to choose an OS, and I'm going to choose my pre-downloaded copy of Raspberry Pi OS, and then choose a storage device. So I'll choose that and write, and I'll just save the settings that I had before. So I'm going to write this, no, yes, and Touch ID, there we go. So it's going to write that image to the NVMe, and while it's doing that, we'll set up the Raspberry Pi. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this guy on, which I need a power cable. If you don't have power, you're not going to get anything. So let's plug it in like so, and I'll show you how to set up the Raspberry Pi 5 for PCI Express devices, specifically NVMe SSDs. Quick editor note about power. It's important that you use the Raspberry Pi power adapter or something equivalent that's going to supply enough power, because this hat is going to use the power from the Pi, and it should use around 5 watts. There's actually a power measurement circuit on the hat. There's not one on the bottom, but there's one on the hat, so you can monitor the power usage of the NVMe SSD that you plug in. The drives that I've tested have all worked fine, but make sure you follow the issue that's linked in the description where I'm testing these things, because there might be some drives that don't work as well if they require too much power for the Pi to supply to it. So we just finished writing that file, writing the Raspberry Pi OS to the NVMe SSD, so I'll pop that out from my computer and get ready to put it on the Pi. And then I'm going to log into the Raspberry Pi that I just booted up, and I'm going to run the command sudo rpi eprom config -- edit. Now if you want a guide for this, I do have a guide on my website. It's the NVMe SSD boot with the Raspberry Pi 5 guide. I will link it in the description so you don't have to sit there and like try to type all the commands as you see them on the screen. But that's this command. It's going to edit the EEPROM so that we can tell it, hey, boot from NVMe if it exists. The key is that we want to change this boot order command to have 6 at the end. That's going to tell the Raspberry Pi first try booting off the NVMe drive, then try microSD, then try USB. So we're going to edit this, go down here and put 6 right there, and then hit Control-O to write the file, and then Control-X. And then now it's going to say, please reboot to apply this update. So I'm going to say sudo reboot, and it's applied that. So the next step is we need to get the hat and the NVMe installed on the Raspberry Pi 5. So I'm going to wait for it to boot up, and I'm going to shut it down. So we're booted back up, and if I go back up to the EEPROM and look at it, it saved it as 416, so we know we're good to go. I'm going to exit out of here and shut it down. Sudo shut down now. Now to get this hat installed, I'm going to disconnect power because I don't want to accidentally short anything out here. So I'll unplug that. And then the final hardware version, the production version they ship, will have the right standoffs and everything. I don't have them, so I'm literally just setting it here. I don't recommend doing that. I need to put this flexible printed circuit board right here, and these gold pins need to face towards the Pi, and this arrow needs to be towards the power side of the Pi, or you can line it up on the hat right here. But the key with these cables is to get them in all the way. If you don't, you're going to have signal issues. So I pull up on this little latch, and I wiggle this a little bit to make sure it's in there nicely, and then I gently push down until it kind of pops in. Now this cable is in, and now I can put the hat up here and work on this part. So I'm going to do the same thing here, making sure that this arrow lines up, and this little tab, you lift it up to let it go, put in the wire, there we go, it's in. And again, I kind of wiggle things a little bit to make sure I'm in nicely, and you might need to go in and out a couple times just to make sure that it's all straight. And then push down on the latch, that latches that in. And that's all you need for this board. And like I said, the production version will be a little bit more secure than this. Follow the instructions that Pineberry gives you. I'm going to put the SSD that I just flashed on the computer in here, and I'm going to go ahead and take out the microSD card. You don't actually need to do this because it should boot off of here anyway, but I'm going to do that just to swing for the fences. Now let's plug in power, and we'll see what happens. So that was the first boot, and then it's going to reboot and resize the disk partition. But now it's doing its boot, and then it's going to shut down again and boot up again, and then it should be up and running. And this time it should boot up and get to the Pi desktop, and there it is. We're booting off that NVMe SSD, and I'm going to do a little benchmark just to see how fast this particular SSD is. Now this is a PCI Express Gen 3x2 SSD, so we should be able to get a lot of speed out of it if we can kind of overclock PCI Express, go to the Gen 3 speeds instead of Gen 2. Okay, so I'm going to log into this thing. I just flashed it. Yes, I'll accept that host key. And if I do lsblk, it should show that there's just an NVMe drive now. If I had the microSD card in there, you'd still see that too. But I'm going to run a benchmark on the NVMe that I'm booting off of to see how Gen 2 and Gen 3 speeds compare. So I'm going to go to pibenchmarks.com. And this is a nice benchmark to run on any storage device on a Raspberry Pi, just to get a point of comparison. Okay, description is Citron Maker Disk. Okay, so we got a score of 31702. I don't know how that score is calculated, but basically we have 350 to 400 megabytes per second maximum write speeds. Now if I say sudo nano boot config.txt. This is where you can change the PCI Express settings. So I'm going to go back to my blog post, and you can see up here is where the PCI Express generation settings. Now this is an interesting thing. If you boot off an NVMe drive, you don't actually have to have this first line, but if you boot off of a microSD card, you have to put this line in to enable that external port. So if you just want to use an NVMe drive for storage, you can put this or this and that enables the external PCI Express. But if you boot off an NVMe, it just automatically knows that. So that's an interesting thing. I don't know why it's not enabled by default. Maybe it will be someday. And this whole discussion that I just had with you will be moot. But I'm going to put that in there anyway, just because I like belt and suspenders. And then we're going to change the generation to 3. So I'm going to write this file and exit. And I'll show you if I say sudo lspci-vvvv. This is how you find out all the information about PCI Express devices. So up here, this is our NVMe drive, NVM Express right here. And if we look at link status is this. It says speed 5 gigatransfers per second, downgraded, by 1, downgraded. So the drive is actually a PCI Express Gen 3 by 2 drive, so it could do a lot more bandwidth. We're going to try to get it to PCI Express Gen 3 by 1, which the Pi supports. Well, hopefully it supports, which should be 8 gigatransfers per second. So let's try that out. We'll say sudo reboot. And the Pi looks like it rebooted. So I'm going to log back in, lspci. We'll do sudo lspci-vvvv and go up to the NVMe drive, which is right here. Link status, 8 gigatransfers per second. It's still downgraded because now it's by 1 and the drive could do by 2, but this should be faster. So let us run that benchmark again. We'll do this, and we'll call it Citron Maker Disk. And now we can see the score is a bit higher. You know, PCI Express Gen 2 versus Gen 3 isn't going to magically make everything so much faster, but throughput can be much faster. So we're getting 776 megabytes per second on this drive. I've gotten up to around 900 megabytes per second on faster NVMe SSDs. So you get a lot more performance when you're doing large file copies and things. So yeah, it's pretty awesome that you can do this. And one other thing to watch for if you're experimenting with different PCI Express devices is you can look into dmessage and you can follow the log. And if there are any errors, they'll start popping up in dmessage. So luckily I'm not seeing any errors at all, even though I just did a bunch of file copies. So it looks like this cable and this board are doing a good job with that. So finally, we are freed from the restriction of microSD cards, and you can run any NVMe SSD. The HatDrive top allows you to do 2230 and 2242 like this one, and the HatDrive bottom, which I haven't gotten around to a lot of testing it, I just plugged it in and made sure it worked. It will allow you to do 2280, which are much more common, and you can get a lot more high performance NVMe SSDs. Even if they're PCIe Gen 3, it's going to be great for a Raspberry Pi. So another thing that you can do with these is actually adapt them to other PCI Express devices. So I'm going to be doing a lot of fun exploration with PCI Express on the Raspberry Pi 5, including this for those who know what this is. So stay tuned and make sure you follow my Pi PCI Express database on the on GitHub and on the website to see all the things that I'm testing and to follow the community as they're testing things like graphics cards and TPUs for AI and machine learning and Frigate and stuff. Lots of cool stuff, storage controllers, and until next time, I'm Jeff Geerling.